Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Graham Walker, president of the Independent Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank in Oakland. Very special thanks to the Toby Philanthropies for sponsoring tonight's American Values Series program. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker. Dr. Williamson Evers is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Educational Excellence at the Independent Institute. He's a very interesting guy. Bill Evers is the project leader for Independent Institute's Comparative Cultures Ethnic Studies curriculum. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education for Policy. He worked on California's K-12 history content standards, history textbook approval, enhanced diploma history test, and support for teaching of history in low-performing districts. So I'd like to invite Dr. Evers to start us off and explain California's ethnic studies controversy and share with us about the Independent Institute's Comparative Cultures Ethnic Studies curriculum. Welcome, Bill Evers.
Thank you, Graham, and good evening. So back in July 2008, I was sitting in my office in the U.S. Department of Education on Maryland Avenue in Washington, D.C., when one of my colleagues brought in a document. Before he handed it to me, he told me, "This is the final thing on this. You won't have to do anything on this in the future. It's set, it's finished." And that's when he handed me and I signed the Education Department's Dear Colleague Guidance letter on racial and ethnic classification. 16 years later, here we are. So in the course of my talk on ethnic studies controversy and the need for an alternative curriculum, there's a fair amount of detail and points of reference that you need to follow and keep track of. So please focus carefully on these details. First thing, you need to know what critical race theory is. The term gets thrown around a lot, but it's an ideology, and it sees everything through the lens of race. It argues that race is woven, that racism is woven throughout all American institutions, current institutions, and it presumes that racism has contributed substantially to all disparate outcomes. So if one race has more of something, or some kind of job, or some kind of awards, or whatever it is, it's because of racism. Okay, then you need to focus on 3 alternative curriculums that are the main players in this field. So the first is the liberated curriculum, and this is the most thoroughgoing critical race theory curriculum. The second is the state board approved curriculum, which some have called critical race theory light, like Miller Lite. And the third is the comparative cultures curriculum, which is the one that I showed earlier and that Graham is holding. So, and it is a non-critical race theory program. It explains that there's a critical race theory, there's some kind of super assimilationist, there's no ethnic sensibilities out there at all view, and then there's the even ground between the two, and that's where we are. So then you need to think about the different ethnic groups. So the main ones are groups like Native Americans, Latinos, Blacks, Jews, Europeans. And the interesting thing is most available ethnic studies curriculums do not cover European ethnic groups like Germans, Irish, Italian, English. And this is despite the fact that Europeans' inclusion is mandated, is required by California Education Code section 1204.5. And of course, despite Europeans' importance in American history and their persisting culture today. The comparative cultures curriculum that we're presenting does cover many of the European ethnic groups, and this is one of its distinctive features. So there's some alternative ways to look at the whole field of ethnic studies. from a scholarly standpoint also. The comparative cultures curriculum that I was the project leader on represents a return to the objective ethnic studies that was popular in universities and colleges from the 1950s through the 1970s. And there were many famous scholars that contributed to this. Quite a few of them were at Harvard. Many of them were sociologists, but there were also historians. So I'll name some of these stellar figures: Oscar Handlin, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Nathan Glazer, Andrew Greeley, Michael Novak, and more recently, the economist Thomas Sowell. They are all in this line of academic prowess, which we could call the Moynihan-Glazer tradition. Now, the liberated curriculum and the board curriculum are based on a different view, a view that sees ethnic studies as a vehicle for identity politics and revolutionary change. So the idea is that select ethnic groups, Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, and perhaps Asians, if they can have their political consciousness raised, are seen as agencies for transformative resistance. That's a phrase that the people promoting this use, which you might say is equivalent to revolutionary overthrow, is a less euphemistic way of describing what they're looking for. So they're going to have transformative resistance to existing commercial society. And we saw this view enunciated in the 1968 student strike at San Francisco State, right across town here, and that strike launched critical ethnic studies in academia. And this view is also embodied in the liberated ethnic studies curriculum and less obviously in the board curriculum. So what does the liberated ethnic studies say in their own document? They say that ethnic studies should critique empire, white supremacy, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, racism, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, anthropocentrism, and other forms of power and oppression. And it says that this is displayed through intersectionality analysis. So there'll be some more on intersectionality in a moment. So about 25 unified school districts, including Santa Ana, Hayward, San Diego, Oakland, Castro Valley, and Berkeley unified school districts, have signed contracts with consultants who promote liberated ethnic studies. Now, my contention is that the liberated and the watered-down state board curricula are essentially the same. The board curriculum removes, the history is that the liberated is descended from earlier drafts of the one that was finally adopted. So that they took out from these earlier drafts the examples of revolutionaries like the Black Panthers, Huey P. Newton, George Jackson, Angela Davis, the Puerto Rican nationalists who shot up Congress. They had those in. Governor Newsom vetoed this earlier draft, essentially. I mean, had a complicated legislative and procedural thing, but in essence, he vetoed it. And then the state board revised it. They also removed some of the jargon, like cis-heteropatriarchy. I know that's the favorite one that you guys want to have rolling off your tongues, but they left it out. And but they've kept the underlying critical race theory ideology, and they've kept intersectionality, and they've kept the putting down of Asians. I'll explain that in a moment. So just to testify to my contention that it's kind of critical race theory light, here's some language from the state board approved model curriculum. Connect to social movements that struggle for social justice and an equitable and democratic society, and conceptualize, imagine, and build new possibilities for a post-racial, post-systematic racism society that promotes collective narratives of transformative resistance, critical hope, and radical healing. I could give you other examples, such as the discussions of dominant narratives or cultural perpetuity, and on and on. They, like any other field, they operate in their own language and so forth. But it's still the same background thinking as the liberated one does. So now a little bit about intersectionality. So it's a doctrine about interlocking and compounded oppression. It's used in both the liberated and the board curriculum as a key pervasive interpretive framework. So first of all, you have to understand that intersectionality has categories that it wants to apply as labels on people. So race, class, gender identity, which might be different from biological sex, gender expression, sexual orientation, ethnicity, country of origin, disability, age, immigrant status, mental health, including, they're careful to note, trauma induced by capitalism, physical health, body shape, and religion. So that's 14 categories. You could obviously subdivide those in certain ways. You could have, there's like, if it's a physical health problem, there's multiple kinds of chronic diseases. Some are more, afflict you more than others maybe. Of course, it's really subjective to the person that's experiencing it. But anyway, the idea with intersectionality is they're going to use these to hand out government benefits. So let's say there's some terrible disease sweeping the country. They might want to give it first to people that are somehow ranked in some intersectionality matrix, most oppressed somehow coming first. It's a very, very complicated quota system. They could use it in evaluating potential contribution to knowledge in a university hiring or a hiring in a government-regulated business. But now let's kind of look at it from within. One of the most devastating ways to criticize something is to say, okay, let's take your premises and let's see what happens. So is this theory kind of self-refuting? Now let's say so I listed 14 things. Let's say we restricted it to 10. Okay, so as philosopher Ronald Lindsay pointed out, that means we have 3,628,800 possible rankings, combinations, permutations of this. So Professor Lindsay asks, how then, if you're deciding on hiring for a university chemistry department slot, and how are you going to decide, using intersectionality, between a 31-year-old Native American gay man who is deaf and a heterosexual Latina middle-aged woman with long COVID? So given the difficulties of coping with over 3 million possible combined interlocking oppressions and the conundrum of ranking these oppressions, it is my contention, and I think it might be yours if you reflect on this, that neither liberated nor state board curricula should be teaching intersectionality as an approach to ethnic studies or an approach to decision-making in our society. There's a further often insurmountable problem. Almost all K-12 teachers are ineligible to teach ethnic studies according to the values of critical race theory. Here I'm somewhat following a man who's written on this named Robbie Suave. If teachers try to explain anything in an ethnic studies class, instead of only hearing the direct narrative of the lived experience of oppressed people, which the followers of critical race theory claim they should be trusted absolutely and not scrutinized, what their narratives are, then any teachers who are explaining, then they're using their privileged status to drown out the narratives of the oppressed. So you've got to be a teacher, but you can never explain anything to your students. So I think, in its own terms, teaching critical ethnic studies is hopelessly difficult or even impossible. Now let me turn to the belittling of Asians and Jews. So this is an exciting field, ethnic studies, as you can all see. So, as Thomas Sowell, who I mentioned before, has written a number of books on ethnic studies, points out, Japanese from peasant backgrounds migrated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They confronted laws restricting their ability to own land until 1952. They were kept in internment camps until World War II. Now, given this history, it would seem to be tough, in my opinion, for critical race theory exponents to plausibly portray Japanese as racist oppressors in American society today. I would add that by 1960, remember the problems in the first half of the 20th century, Japanese had higher earnings than whites by 1960. Now, how do we explain this? Tom and Sol and others say possibly proportionally more students in Asian households may have been encouraged by their parents, by their family to study hard, seeking achievement and adopting a work ethic. Nonetheless, critical race theory proponents portray Asians as a contrived model minority, and they say that in reality, the critical race theory people say that in reality, Asians are white adjacent and racist oppressors. Now let's turn to the Jews. The Jews are an ethnic group that has suffered oppression like no other. But according to critical race ideology, especially as found in earlier drafts of the liberated and board curricula, Jews are also supposed to be white adjacent, that is part of the oppressive white ruling group and exemplars of settler colonialism. And we saw what this attitude can mean in practice during the anti-Semitic harassment of Jewish students at Columbia University and UCLA. In the liberated affiliated district of Santa Ana, which is in Orange County, where I live, senior officials in the district proposed holding meetings on Jewish holidays so that Jews would be unable to participate. And district board members said that Jews were racist white oppressors and Jews should not be included as an ethnic topic in ethnic studies classes. I want to turn to a more concrete topic, and this has to do with blacks and housing, and it has to do with something called redlining. So redlining is found in both the board curriculum and in the liberated curriculum. For example, the board curriculum says students will be able to comprehend the current housing crisis in terms of gentrification, resegregation, and redlining. And liberated curriculum says, how do banks redline? By denying people of color in low-income neighborhoods loans to purchase a home. So redlining, the word comes from drawing a line around a specific geographical area, a neighborhood, and it was a New Deal federal policy in the Franklin Roosevelt days, and it harmed blacks and also low-income whites that wanted to buy homes in these areas. Now, redlining was outlawed in California 60 years ago. A few of you are old enough to remember the Rumford Fair Housing Act. It was somewhat controversial in those days. But critical race theory proponents say redlining is still going on. Now remember, anything that has any possible connection to race, they say, is governed by racism. But we still, if we look at this allegation, the suggestion from them, we have to ask some questions. So the claim is that redlining is still common. But wouldn't banks, other banks, there are several banks out there, or other lenders swoop in to gain new business if creditworthy buyers are not being offered loans by the alleged redliners? And wouldn't wouldn't loan failure rates show it if lenders were discriminating based on race or neighborhood rather than making loans based on credit scores and ability to repay? Well, yes, it should show up, but it doesn't in the research. So claims of redlining are frequently found in ethnic studies courses. In contrast, in the comparative cultures curriculum, we don't hand down a conclusion. We have students read both sides of the argument about this. So debates are actually one of the features of our curriculum. You don't find them enough in K-12 curriculum at all. But anyway, we have them. So on controversial issues like affirmative action, big city policing, the success of individuals and groups via economic striving and charitable self-help, or success via political organizing and government regulation, we have debates on this. So we have 82 high school level lesson plans. It's free. There's no charge. It's just sitting there on the internet. It's turnkey. It's teacher-ready. There are links to original documents, to short videos, to all sorts of short articles. The information in the comparative cultures, ethnic studies is factually accurate. If you find something that is inaccurate, please email me right away and we will fix it. There are multiple perspectives presented in a balanced way. The questions are designed to encourage thoroughgoing analysis. Substantively, I believe that the comparative cultures is better than any other available ethnic studies curriculum. Teachers and districts can use all of these lessons or only some of them. Parents, I would call on you. Here is my call to action. Parents, go to your teachers and school board and ask for the comparative cultures curriculum. Teachers, go to your administrator who supervises curriculum. School board members and taxpayers, go to your local superintendent and ask for comparative cultural ethnic studies. I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evers. Let's welcome Barbara Nemko now. Barbara Nemko is the County Superintendent of the Napa County Office of Education and co-chair of California Department of Education's Reading Task Force. Welcome, Barbara Nemko.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. Nice to see all of you interested in this topic. As we've seen, it's quite controversial. What's fascinating to me is how we got here. And we got here because there were two studies that were done. One was in 2017 and one was in 2021 that purported to say that when students of color took ethnic studies classes, it greatly improved their academic achievement. Now, I've been in education for many more decades than I'm going to admit to you. And that has always been a problem. There has always been an achievement gap. And so educators are always desperately looking for the thing that will help to close that achievement gap. We want all our kids to be successful. And so when this study said things like, well, their GPA will increase by an average of 1.4 points. Wow. And it will miraculously turn C students into B+ students. Everybody cheered. This is wonderful. And so the governor decided it would be a really good thing to mandate ethnic studies. Who would not want to see all our students become more successful? The only problem is the study was horribly flawed. And what's interesting about that is when I went to graduate school, I learned that you can take almost any study, and if you read it 17 times, you're going to find the fatal flaw. Well, apparently nobody read this one. Nobody read either of them 17 times. And so with all its flaws, suddenly we were mandating ethnic studies. I am happy to say that we have with us tonight, and you will hear from him later, Richard Sander, who is the author of the paper that truly debunked these two studies. And I would describe it to you, except my recollection of statistics is too far in the past to be able to explain all the ins and outs of it, but he will, I'm sure, and trust me, the studies were completely flawed. None of that was true. So yes, then they went out and they said, okay, let's have people develop curriculum, bring it to the state board, and we'll adopt something in ethnic studies. And as you heard from Bill, the liberated folks were Johnny on the spot. They developed curriculum, they brought it to the state board, and the state board said, pretty much, hell no. And the governor said, this will never see the light of day, because it was extremely, among all its other flaws, extremely anti-Semitic. Now, the four groups that ethnic studies was supposed to be about in California were Blacks, Hispanics, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, and whoever the fourth group is that, of course, I've suddenly forgotten. But nowhere in there were Israel and the Palestinians. As far as I know, looking around, Israel and the Palestinians are not part of the major 4 groups in California. But somehow the liberated folks put those in, and that was one of the things that they emphasized in the curriculum. So now you have a mandated curriculum that every student obviously must take that's going to teach anti-Semitism. So we have mandated anti-Semitism. Not a good thing. Now, why is this happening? In California, we have all kinds of laws and provisions that will not allow this. California says in section 51500, just so you know I'm not making it up, that a teacher shall not give instruction and the school district shall not sponsor any activity that promotes a discriminatory bias on the basis of race or ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, nationality, or sexual orientation, or because of a characteristic listed in section 220, which I won't read to you. I could go on. There's laws in section 51501, section 220, but it's very clear that we cannot do this. So how does it happen? Well, this course does not have to start until 25-26, and by 2030, students have to have had an ethnic studies course in order to graduate. But LA Unified started it really early, and they put it into their curriculum in 2020. They adopted it on August 25th, 2020. And remember, this is really supposed to be a high school curriculum, but they took the liberated curriculum and they integrated it into pre-K through 8. Now, the liberated folks insist that their curriculum is the only true ethnic studies. Everything else is false. And some of the things that they put into the training that they do with teachers, which they used to have listed on their website, but conveniently it's all disappeared. They advised teachers who were going to use the materials, and they said, if you tell them your plans, is the administration likely to be supportive? If you don't think your administration will be supportive, try to fly under the radar. Don't let them know what you're doing. This was copied right from what they used to have on their website. Keep your door closed, that's what they tell them, until you grow strong enough as a group to pressure them to accept what we're trying to do. And that came from their section, Preparing to Teach Palestine, a Toolkit. Because it fits into which of the 4 main groups that we were supposed to be studying? They vilify and demonize one country, Israel. No other state in the world, no other country, not North Korea, not China, not South Sudan or Eritrea, not any of the countries where slavery is still happening. But Israel, yes. They completely ignore and tacitly condemn the worst human rights abuses in the world, but they instruct students to revile and hate Israel. And this is happening, you heard the list of districts, and there are many more that have adopted this curriculum. They also denounce capitalism, traditional families, and the territorial integrity of the United States in a course that is mandated for every student to have. So they became a nonprofit corporation, and they go district to district trying to sell the curriculum. Whoa, my time is almost up. So what can we do? I wanted to read you some examples of things that they say, but real quick, they ask 14-year-olds to write an acknowledgement to apologize for taking indigenous people's land. So we make children feel guilty for something that they were born how many hundreds of years later? And now it's their fault. It's inappropriate and very disturbing to what's happening to kids. So what can we do? Number 1, the law is clear. We can't just say we're putting guardrails on here. We have to penalize districts who are doing this. We have to say, no, you can't do this. We have got to come up, and Bill has given us a curriculum that would teach the things we want, and I know my 60 seconds were up 72 seconds ago. So we'll do more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. Let's hear from Lauren Janov. Lauren Janov is an attorney, education consultant, and co-founder of the Palo Alto Parent Alliance. Lauren Janov.
So thank you for including me in your discussion today about ethnic studies. I would like to share about how communities, and importantly parents, are viewing the ethnic studies course rollouts that is happening across the district, or across the state of California now. Typically, it takes something close to an earthquake to shake parents' attention on secondary school curriculum matters. Understandable. I've been helping public school parents advance their interests and concerns for decades. Every so often, there'll be something that captures their attention, but there has been nothing quite like ethnic studies that has captured their attention. And it started in July 2019, and it's increased almost exponentially ever since. That summer, the California Department of Education released a recommended model curriculum. We've heard about that, for public comment. The project initially had no detractors of note, but it exploded once the public read what the state wanted students as young as 13 to learn. That document garnered 20,000 public comments in a few weeks' time and national attention, all scathing, almost all scathing, and it was punctuated by a takedown by Governor Newsom and State Board of Education members. The California Department of Education was sent scrambling to fix the most controversial project it had ever undertaken. So what went wrong? That draft embraced liberated ethnic studies, which, in other words, anti-racism, political activism education. That was a far cry from what Californians were expecting and what the legislature had promised, an inclusive, culturally relevant curriculum that would help students appreciate the contributions of multiple cultures. That comes from the law. It was to cover their harrowing journeys in America, too, and the hope was that this course will move our students to make a positive change in their local communities as well as our state. But what did they see instead? They saw major ethnic groups that were omitted: Armenians, Hindus, Japanese, Jews, Koreans, Sikhs. They saw stereotyping and discrimination of entire groups. They saw teachers instructed to get to know critical race theory, tagged in that model curriculum as a key theoretical framework for ethnic studies. They saw capitalism listed as a form of oppression. And they saw the course's final assignment: make your own political activism project, employing the lessons learned on power, oppression, resistance, and revolution. In other words, a college-level political education theory and pedagogy course. Was that age appropriate for 13-year-olds? No, according to the State Board of Education, which now has two key warnings. One, don't teach ethnic studies as they do in college from a political point of view. Quote, in K-12 education, it is imperative that students are exposed to multiple perspectives and taught to think critically and form their own opinions. And two, a trigger warning. Beware, there are negative emotions and traumas in ethnic study courses, so make sure your site has support, including counselors, and this is key. The state also advises school districts to involve their community early and often, again from the model curriculum. It is important that all steps related to the development of a local curriculum are transparent and involve all stakeholders in the community. Community partnerships and accountability are central. So fast forward to this year, 2024. Local school districts are now designing their own courses with no state standards and a final model curriculum, which the state board VP said before she voted yes, well, nothing's perfect. School districts are really just on their own to figure out how to teach this course. Many are teaching liberated ethnic studies. A few communities are fine with that, but most that I talk to and see are not. Here's how 4 districts are heeding or ignoring their local community and parent concerns. One school district in San Diego County is inviting the community to weigh in, sharing the full curriculum and offering 3 opportunities for input before the course is tested in the classroom, and then the community gets a 4th chance at it before the final vote. The board meetings are calm, the community feels validated. Another school district, Mid-State, was approached by community members concerned about the liberated ethnic study contractor the district had hired and was thinking of rehiring. The issue there were many school board meetings, many hours of public comment, and it became an issue for the school board election issue. So the community was involved both at the board level as well as in the ballot box. Third school district, this one in Northern California, the board approved an issue-free ethnic studies course outline. But when the course hit the classroom, the course was light on ethnic groups to free up time for students to do a deep dive in highly political college-level race and resistance studies. Students learned that the U.S. is, quote, racist every moment of every day, everywhere. Black militant power groups were prominent, and Martin Luther King got barely a footnote. Like the state model, that curriculum too had trigger warnings, only those were explicit and alarming. Community members there, though, proactively got hold of the course lessons and sent their observations to the district, importantly before the board voted, before the yes or no vote was before them, so they had time to make an adjustment. But sometimes doors don't open for the community, like in Palo Alto Unified, which is the district that I live in. Community members, including myself, were concerned after the ethnic studies consultant the district hired calls liberated ethnic studies an essential curriculum. It recommends defund the police for student activism projects, and it suggests drafting manifestos as a writing assignment, using armed race-based separatist groups as their model. We've been polite and we have been persistent, and we have been rebuffed repeatedly by senior administrators and local school board presidents. So we decided to organize. We gave ourselves a name, Palo Alto Parent Alliance Pause Campaign. We filed Public Records Act request, and we circulated a petition 1,400 people signed. Yet, a year later, we still haven't been given access to the curriculum. We are in the dark. The course is being taught now and will be required next fall. Happily, though, on Tuesday, Palo Altans voted in 3 school board candidates who ran on a campaign platform that underscored the importance of community input. So I'm going to end with a few comments for the community members and the audience. First, there's time. The proposed state model curriculum graduation requirement may not ever come to fruition, and even if it does, the earliest that it would hit would be fall 2026. Get involved, submit Public Records Act requests for the names of the consultants in the district's ethnic studies lessons. Meet with school board administrators, school administrators and board members. And be polite. Make it easy for busy school staff. Show them exactly where the problems are that you have spotted and offer up solutions. Fortunately, the Independent Institute's curriculum, there is now a high-quality, free, non-liberated option for schools to consider. Parents will appreciate its focus on critical thinking and multiple perspectives. Its foundation is exposing students to views from across the political spectrum. And they will appreciate its inclusivity. For example, the curriculum delves deeply into civil rights. A chapter is dedicated to African American civil rights leaders, from Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks to those in the Black Power movement. It asks students to compare and contrast their views, their approaches, and legacies 50 years later. It teaches students that Jewish Americans were instrumental in that civil rights movement and asks, did that help reduce anti-Semitism in America? And it has students ponder whether the tools of democracy, the courts, the laws, the right to demonstrate, the right to vote, improved Asian and Latino civil rights, contrasting where those groups were 150, 250 years ago to today. Anyway, I'm at my end, but I'm happy to answer any questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's hear now from Richard Sander, who is an economist and the Duke Minier Distinguished Professor of Law at UCLA. He is a leading empiricist on racial issues in America and has published books on affirmative action and on housing segregation. Welcome, Richard Sander.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you all for coming, and those online, thank you for taking the time for this. So I'm coming here as someone who simply works in the area. You know, I met Bill this evening and have read about his curriculum in the last few weeks. I just want to give you some perspectives of someone who sort of comes to this field trying to look for truth and trying to understand what's the best way to teach people how to think about these issues. So first thing I want to get across is that the liberated ethnic studies approach, or the critical race theory approach, has a kind of a built-in flaw, which is that it's structured around the assumption that one of its core tenets is true, i.e., that racial inequality, racial problems, are fundamentally driven by racial discrimination and race itself. So race-neutral explanations just don't make it within this framework. So I study housing segregation, for example, and if you take a liberated ethnic studies or a critical race theory perspective, you think housing segregation is still high today, as it is, because there must be something racist going on. There must be, therefore, severe discrimination in lending and home sales and apartment rentals. But there are other explanations of housing segregation that have a lot of empirical support. So, for example, there are network theories that if you live in a very segregated city, then the information you get about housing tends to come from friends and neighbors and coworkers who share your ethnicity. So you have sort of an ethnically structured information network, and that can lead to perpetuation of segregation. Well, that helps explain a lot of facts that are otherwise hard to explain with the racism approach, such as why does San Diego have very low segregation, whereas Chicago has very high segregation? If you do opinion surveys or discrimination audits, you don't really see a difference in behavior or attitudes across those areas. But you do see differences in the information networks. So the point is that when we think about racial issues, it's vitally important that we be open-minded, that we be able to test alternate perspectives. So a couple of the speakers have gotten this point across, but to me, the really important thing about what Bill's project has done is that its focus is not on trying to teach Doctrine A versus Doctrine B. It's not a war between a free market approach to these issues or a left-wing approach to these issues. It's about teaching people how to consider multiple perspectives, about how to debate the questions, about how to engage in inquiry. How do we figure out what the facts are? That is what a discipline is. That's what academia is supposed to be about. That's what education is supposed to be about. The problem with the CRT or liberated ethnic studies approach is that it's an ideology. It's an indoctrination approach. That's the fundamental issue that I think is involved here. The second thing, which is related to that, is that if you take that sort of liberated approach, if you take that CRT approach, then you are kind of automatically casting any other approach as racist, right? If you think that these problems are fundamentally about racism, then anyone who doesn't take that approach is engaged in racism. Therefore, it's a battle between good and evil. And I think we saw a perfect example of that in our heckler earlier this evening. Someone who thinks Bill's project is evil, and therefore the appropriate response is shout him down. Well, that approach has had an incredibly powerful effect on America over the last decade. I mean, working at a place like UCLA, I'm just aware of how many of my colleagues are intimidated by the fear that if they take even pretty reasonable positions on a whole range of issues related to race, they run the risk of being called racist. And that's about the worst thing that you can call anyone in America today. So it leads to hushed dialogue. It leads to suppression of discussion. It leads to chilled research. And, it doesn't change people's fundamental ethos. They're aware that all this is going on, and that accumulates a lot of resentment. What I've seen in academia over the last 2 years is a beginning of folks pushing back. And, I think that we're seeing that on the political scene too. There's a lot of sympathy for Trumpian or Republican positions, not necessarily because of an agreement with policies, but a sort of perception that there's kind of an intellectual rot going on in a lot of progressive politics against which one needs to push back. A third aspect of all this is an attitude towards empiricism. So if you're focused on an ideology, if you're focused on a doctrine, as opposed to a competition between ideas, then your attitude towards data is that data is there to help us show what we already know. It's not there to surprise us or to test ideas, but to confirm ideas. So the example that was brought up before about this infamous study by Denner and P. at Stanford about the effect of ethnic studies curriculum is a textbook example. And I don't want to take the time to sort of walk through that because it would take probably 10 minutes to really explain the arguments. But if you do a Google search for my name, Richard Sander, and tablet, maybe also put in ethnic studies, but probably just Richard Sander tablet, will bring up the study. And it's a pretty straightforward read. It's just a textbook example of folks taking data that doesn't support a position and putting it through enough contortions so that it sort of makes a plausible kind of half case. But even mild scrutiny just causes this to fall apart. You don't need to be a statistician to understand why this study is goofy. I mean, just to take one example, the authors didn't separate out people who actually took ethnic studies classes from people who didn't. They just compared people who were eligible for an ethnic studies class with people who weren't eligible. Well, that's not really a test of the effect of the ethnic studies class. It really has nothing to do with it. So this study is really quite goofy, and it's kind of entertaining to read what its problems were. But what's disturbing is that it got published. It got published in a peer-reviewed journal. How could that happen? Well, it goes back to the second point I made, which is that this was a journal that didn't really specialize in the topic that was being discussed. And they thought, well, this is a ideologically well-pedigreed study. Do we really want to take the risk of causing controversy by not publishing this? So it's an unhealthy environment. And I think that the comparative cultures approach is incredibly important because it's really trying to restore this to an actual discipline. So I've got 60 seconds left. I'm going to tell you about one other thing. I'm at University of California, and folks who were pushing the Liberated Ethnic Studies program were disappointed that the state legislature and the governor didn't fully go for their approach. So what they've been trying to do at the university for the last 3 years is to get the university to adopt as a requirement for attending the University of California, taking a Liberated Ethnic Studies class in California high schools. Okay? It's a pretty clever approach because if you can mandate that, then high schools aren't going to offer sort of a menu of different ethnic studies class. They're just going to all offer the Liberated Ethnic Studies class. That issue is coming to a vote at the University of California Senate next month. And the fact that Bill has this alternative curriculum out there that is balanced and is a real discipline, I think is a game changer for that discussion. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you so much. Let's hear from Walter Myers. Walter Myers III is an adjunct professor at Biola University, where he also serves as a member of their professional advisory board for the School of Social Science, Technology, and Health. He's also a senior fellow at the Seattle-based Discovery Institute, writing for that institute's American Center for Transforming Education. Welcome, Walter Myers III.
Thank you, Graham. As an educator and writer on K-12 education, I fully support the Comparative Cultures Ethnic Studies curriculum. My only wish is that its design and intended delivery reach down to grades 9 and 10 instead of only grades 11 and 12. But I do understand that it's not limited and that other grades can use it. The curriculum provides, I think, a balanced perspective on the American ethnic history, which is not found, unfortunately, as others have intimated, in either the California Ethnic Studies model curriculum or the Liberated Ethnic Studies model curriculum that was rejected as the original California model curriculum. The comparative cultures curriculum rightfully recognizes America's sordid past with slavery and Jim Crow segregation for Black Americans, broken promises to and subjugation of Native Americans, poor treatment of early Asian immigrants, and the historical patterns of anti-Semitism against Jewish Americans. But it also recognizes that America, for all its faults, was built on the foundational idea that all men and women are created equal, and they are endowed with the natural rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. While these benefits were deferred for so many, over the past 6 decades, America has sought to live up to its creed of equality. Thus, we've seen many triumphs and achievements across the ethnic landscape. The Comparative Cultures curriculum maintains an appropriate balance, I think, of being clear-eyed about the often sad moments and struggles we experience as a country over the centuries, while also acknowledging and celebrating our march of progress. Consequently, the curriculum serves to bring students together in understanding our shared humanity, focusing on how unity can flow out of our diversity. This unifying principle is lacking in both the California or liberated model curriculums, which focus not on progress, but on how ethnic groups continue to be marginalized through systems of power and oppressed by ongoing white supremacy, white nationalism, institutional racism, and imperialist/colonial beliefs. The reason for this divisive focus is that both curriculums are deeply tied to critical race theory, as others have noted. For example, the instructional guidance section of the California curriculum encourages teachers and administrators to familiarize themselves with CRT as a lens through which to approach ethnic studies. Critical race, and I quote, critical race theory, CRT, is a practice of interrogating race and racism in society. CRT recognizes that race is not biologically real, but is socially constructed and socially significant. It acknowledges that racism is embedded within systems and institutions that replicate racial inequality, codified in law, embedded in structures, and woven into public policy. Now, a key tenet of CRT is its assertion that the law has been historically complicit in upholding white supremacy, which is the social domination and subordination of blacks and other people of color. Contrary to the longstanding legal principle that the law should be colorblind and subsequently treat all people equally, CRT believes colorblindness is a defective concept that only serves to remedy the most blatant forms of discrimination, such as mortgage redlining and academic hiring practices. CRT maintains that though the law has worked to suppress explicit forms of white racism, everyday social practices in America continue outside the purview of legal remediation. In other words, critical race theorists believe racism has been and continues to be, quote, pervasive, systemic, and deeply ingrained, and a permanent part of the American culture. It's an unfortunate fact that in the past, laws were sometimes explicitly written to discriminate against blacks and other people of color, and even neutral laws were intentionally and purposefully abused. However, these discriminatory laws have largely either been struck down by the courts or replaced with non-discriminatory laws by Congress and state legislatures. And while colorblind jurisprudence has its limitations, since it cannot reach into the hearts and the minds of human beings in their everyday social practices to completely eliminate discrimination, the argument that racism continues to be systemic and supported by the law is unconvincing, particularly when virtually all urban cities and school districts now have a high degree of ethnic diversity in their leadership. The Liberated Studies curriculum is unfortunately explicit, as others have noted, in its promotion of CRT, which is incorporated into every aspect of the curriculum. What's worse, the curriculum begins as early as pre-K, exposing very young children to concepts they are not mature enough to critically evaluate. For example, consider the following language taken verbatim from a unit titled, What's Normal, intended for grades pre-K to second grades. We understand and critique the relationship between white supremacy, racism, anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, xenophobia, patriarchy, cis-heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, ageism, anthropocentrism, and other forms of power and oppression. A 4-year-old is sitting here listening to this, okay? So that's just a taste of the language of division and indoctrination of CRT concepts which pervade the document, which, to emphasize again, begins at a stage when children are most impressionable. It is not language that seeks to bring people together in unity. It demonizes those with more traditional, conservative, or religious views, and even makes the white child in the room the natural enemy solely based on what their ancestors may or may not have done. Neither the California nor liberated curriculums promote the purported values of empathy and healing among ethnic groups, but instead lionize certain ethnic groups while casting all the faults on one. Further, there's no recognition of the important historical context that mistreatment of ethnic groups in our country over the past 2.5 centuries is part of the human condition that has been endemic across all people in the world for millennia. There is no one ethnic group over the history of man that hasn't dominated or subjugated others, either within or outside their own ethnic group. The key to racial and ethnic reconciliation moving forward is to acknowledge our past while forging ahead in unity out of our diversity. I believe the comparative cultures curriculum will provide California students with a diverse set of ethnic studies views and resources that will guide them into a greater appreciation of our history and a celebration of how far we've come as a nation. Thank you.
We have a pretty high-powered group of panelists here. We're going to talk together amongst them for a few moments and then take questions. As a reminder, the questions can be written on those sheets of paper on your chair, be picked up. We also have questions coming in from our online viewers who are joining us currently. At the close of the program, you can find at the table in the back a 1.5-page list here of resources made available by our panelists. If you want to follow up on some details, grab that sheet of paper on the way out. So let's talk first among our panelists for a few minutes here. One thing that I found most striking, and I'll begin with Lauren, is how could it be that in apparently the Palo Alto schools, the curriculum has been developed and maybe even being taught in a way that the content was concealed for over a year? How could that be?
Well, not for lack of community effort. It's because I would suspect that the leadership of the school board was not putting pressure on the administrative staff to share. It gets messy in Palo Alto. It's a community that's very invested in education, and if some controversial thing comes up, it can take a lot of time. And my thought was that they would think that it would just go away. Unfortunately, the group of parents, the community members, the 1,400 who signed, are still very eager. And now we have a new board majority that's committed to community input. So
I heard you say that. I guess that's good news.
That's good news. That's very good news. But as of Tuesday. On Monday, we were still worried.
Bill.
So I was in the math wars of the 1990s in Palo Alto. And it is a very exciting school district, and the parents are very involved. It possibly causes some administrators to tear their hair out. But you know what? Whose children are they anyway?
So you may have other questions for our panelists. Do you want to just maybe ask Barbara something before we go on to audience questions? Barbara has a lot of knowledge as an educator and leader.
I would like to hear from Barbara how, let's say, a teacher or a parent learns about comparative ethnic studies, comparative cultures, ethnic studies, or learns about this whole controversy and wants to get involved. What should a parent do? What should a teacher do?
The best thing to do is go to the school board meeting. Bring friends, because it may not be friendly, but bring people to the school board meeting and explain exactly why. Bring the curriculum, give an example of a lesson, and compare it to a lesson that is being taught in the school currently that you're not happy with. And I think it will become perfectly clear. Remember that even though there may not be many people in the audience, school board meetings are now live streamed. So there are people watching, and it's usually posted on the website. So then you can write a letter to the editor and say, at the school board meeting, I showed them a better curriculum, and if you want to see what it looks like, go to the school board website, look at the meeting, and you'll see for yourself the examples. Now, if you agree with me, come to the next meeting. Put the pressure on.
So it doesn't have to be agendized already, because there's a time period when audience members can say, you don't get to talk for hours and hours, but you can talk for 2 minutes or whatever the agenda allows.
Right. Public comment.
They have a public comment period in California, local school districts.
Right. And they have
Always there.
public comment for items on the agenda and public comment for items not on the agenda.
Exactly.
So there is that opportunity, and they can't stop you.
One confusing
But
point.
be polite, firm but polite.
Absolutely.
Good advice. One thing I found very confusing is that we know that the mandated high school ethnic studies course starts the following school year. But I think I heard Walter say that even young children are already getting this kind of teaching without a mandate, but it's being done anyway. Did I hear you right?
Yes.
Kindergarten.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about the liberated model, and I think someone else had mentioned, one of you had mentioned this as well, is that it starts with pre-K.
Right.
And it really starts right off with CRT and all the concepts of CRT for very young children who are impressionable. I really think that's a travesty, because I think children at that stage, if you look at sort of the trivium of how children are being taught, this is the grammar stage. There's the grammar, the logic, and the rhetoric stage. It's not really till children reach that rhetoric stage, which should say around 7 or 8, that they can evaluate these types of situations. Just learning history is fine, but when you start to get into controversial issues like this in terms of ethnic studies, then I think it's inappropriate to do that until they can reason through this. And that's what I like about the comparative studies, is that it asks them to reason, it asks them to think about this, it invites debate. You don't get that in the liberated studies.
So we're talking about a high school mandated course, but actually it's already being taught even to younger children.
Yes.
Yes, indeed.
How can that be? Someone explain that to me. Legally, how does that work? School boards have the prerogative to
Part of
do
what
it.
we're talking about is the difference between what the state is mandating and what local school boards can do.
Right.
Local school boards have a lot of discretion to do what they want, and our larger school districts have drunk the Kool-Aid.
Mm-hmm.
There's also teacher discretion. So yes, the school board has said yes. Yes, the State Board of Education has said this. But the teacher closes the door, and the teacher can do the liberated, can do a lesson from the state model curriculum, can do a lesson from comparative cultures. Unless a parent discovers it or a very wise student discovers it and brings it to some authority. And even so, the teachers' union will protect the teacher if the teacher can plausibly say, well, I'm covering the material. So it's a very loosely linked system, the educational system, which makes it charming in some ways when they're doing the right thing, but it makes it very frustrating if you're trying to improve things, even in a sensible way. I think that's fair to say.
I don't think anybody here would like to eliminate teacher discretion entirely. Barbara, can you comment on that?
No, I don't want to eliminate discretion, but I think that you cannot be putting ideas in children's heads without giving them any opportunity to discuss it. You're just indoctrinating them, and that's not the purpose of school. The purpose of school is to teach children how to think, and critical thinking and critical race theory are antithetical to one another.
Very clear. Are there other questions lurking among you for one another before we turn the page here? I just imagine there might be. Well, here's a question then coming from the audience. Were there other inputs into the comparative cultures curriculum besides Dr. Evers, such as historians or learning education specialists?
Well, so much as I might like to pretend that I did the whole thing just springing out of, like, Minerva out of the head of Zeus or something, I guess it really should be Athena if I'm going to do Zeus, right?
Right.
Anyway, the point is, I worked very closely with a professional curriculum developer who had done many courses that have been accepted by University of California's president's office in the past. And so I was supervising it and doing a lot of the work, but this individual did lots of the work and is a specialist in this. I have a PhD in political science. This has been run by a number of historians. If you look at the first page of it, you'll see endorsements from all sorts of people, some of whom have PhDs in social sciences, and some of whom are extremely experienced educators, some of whom have been officials like me. I've been a U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education. So it's been run by a lot of people, but that doesn't mean there's not room for improvement. And the wonderful thing about when I was growing up, of course, there was no internet and no computerized courses. I mean, I can remember when Education Program for Gifted Youth first came out long, long ago. But the point is, you can fix things on the internet. If there's something wrong, we can fix it. And so we invite comments that are helpful.
I think that one of the major contributors to the curricular content was, in fact, someone who was a principal in the San Diego Unified School District, and she piloted a ethnic studies course in that school district. So the actual hands-on educators were involved in your project.
That is correct.
Here's another question. Has the comparative cultures ethnic studies curriculum been adopted in any schools or districts thus far?
Well, we only just launched it, so I mean, that would be very exciting if a lot of school districts, no, but a lot of them are looking at it. And so we have several charter schools, we have several county offices. So county offices don't really educate a huge number of students, mostly local school districts do it. So, but they educate often some kids, they sometimes run Head Start. That's going to be too young for this, but they have kids who are in juvenile hall, and sometimes they have some kids that have cognitive difficulties that they're doing, and they also run 365 days, so they don't have to adopt on a cycle the way a school district does. It's kind of complicated. The school districts do pilotings and debates, and the state law actually says, you can take the officially approved model curriculum, that's the one I've been criticizing as the board curriculum, and Walter was calling the California curriculum. You can adopt that one straightforwardly, but if you want to adopt a different one, like the comparative cultures one, like the liberated one, you can announce it. You have 2 meetings where parents can see something in the back of the room or something like that and can come up and make comments. Or taxpayers, anybody that comes to the school board meeting can do it, and then you can adopt it. So it's difficult but flexible, or flexible but difficult, however you want to look at it.
One of the most stunning things we heard this evening, I think, was from Richard Sander, who was describing the ways in which certain studies on the effects of ethnic studies curricula were, in fact, misleading to the point of being false. How could it be that this kind of research is being published in peer-reviewed journals? This is a much larger issue than ethnic studies, but it bears on ethnic studies. Is the world of academic research really that turned in on its ideological objectives?
Yeah, I think a big problem is that many establishment publications have become ideologically rigid. There's an accepted viewpoint, and articles that promote that viewpoint get kid glove treatment that they don't deserve. Mm-hmm. One huge red flag with the Dee Penner study was that the authors wouldn't share their data. If someone won't share their data, that to me ought to be prima facie reason for rejecting it.
Red flag.
So let me explain a problem here. It's not really a defense, but here's what happens. People who study schools, in order to get agreement to get the data from the schools, they sign something saying that they won't reveal the data and that somehow individually identifiable information might somehow get out. And so they protect themselves against this. So I was very involved in the math wars, and we have a case like that where somebody has a district and they give a pseudonym to the district and they say, it turns out this curriculum is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and the critics want to come in and say, well, I don't think so. Did you combine the 6th grade from last year with the 7th grade from this year in the wrong way? Whatever it is, we need to look at your data in order to check that out. And the people that did the study say, well, you can't. So it's a problem in the field of education. And the whole human subject thing gets drawn in, possibly in a wrong way, because you can release a lot of data without individually identifiable.
Right. It is a problem, but I'm subject to those restrictions too. And when I am negotiating with authorities for restricted data, I make sure that there is a provision that says there needs to be a replication mechanism.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
maybe that means that someone who wants to replicate will need to sign the same contract I did,
Right.
but they'll get to see the data.
Right.
And those values are
They are
for-
integral to the whole academic project.
because otherwise no one believes the research. And
Right.
the research can tell us the truth if we do it right.
One audience member asks you specifically, Richard Sander, how can audience members influence the upcoming UC decision about the
question.
admission requirement?
Email me and volunteer services. sander@law.ucla.edu. Just Google my name and you can find me. Yeah, we have a number of things that we're trying to do, and help would be welcome. We want to reach as many of the 10,000 UC faculty as possible and make them aware of this alternative, because I think that if UC professors understand that it's not a choice between not doing ethnic studies and doing liberate ethnic studies, but doing it well and doing it really ideologically, it's got to be an easy choice.
One of the other striking things we heard tonight was from Lauren Janov, who read us portions of the California Code against discrimination. And so one audience member asked, who's responsible for enforcing California education law against bias? The things you read us.
That was.
Oh, that was
Barbara.
you? That was you. I'm
Barbara.
sorry, I got confused. Yeah. Who's,
That's okay.
I can answer it, but I think you should probably.
Well, you're a lawyer, so I'd rather you answer it. I'm not an attorney.
Well, there are claims that you can bring, just for instance, on discrimination claims. They're not a very agile tool, and that people aren't very satisfied with the outcomes of those. There's lawsuits or Title VI complaints to the federal government, which probably will have a change in focus now with the new administration. So there's not really very many good options if there's discrimination, other than having relationships. It comes all the way back to that.
There's also a
That's-
thing called the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that might entertain some interest in.
And so there are some lawsuits, as you heard earlier. Berkeley's being sued, Hayward's being sued. There's another, I'm not allowed to say the other district that's about to be sued. But this is not a good way to do this for a number of reasons. Number one, we spend enough money on litigation. That money should be used for learning, not for litigation. Two, it's very hard to sue because in order to do that, you have to have a family in the district that's willing to be the plaintiff in the lawsuit, which means that parents have to actually see what their kids are doing in this ethnic studies program. And sometimes it's not in ethnic studies. It's woven in. It's in art. It's in math. It's in reading. And so unless your child comes home and says, I was really scared in school today because they told me that it's my fault, that I'm privileged. What does that mean, Mommy? I'm in kindergarten. What does that mean? Then you might find a parent who says, oh my God, but they don't even know where to start in filing a lawsuit. So yes, you can. And what we all can do is, you have families and friends and neighbors who have children in school. Remind them that this controversy is happening and that it's really important that they go to their school board meetings and ask to see under public comment for items not on the agenda, where do I get to see the ethnic studies curriculum? Who did you contract with to develop the curriculum? Who did the professional development? And taught the teachers what to do and taught them how to close the door. And then when you know that, you'll be able to become a plaintiff.
And more so than that, because the board can't answer you in the public meeting.
That's right.
Is you just write a letter and ask for it as a Public Records Act request.
So another thing that one finds in this field is parents that are afraid to stick their head out because they fear that some arbitrary thing might be done to their children. And so this was a major aspect of the psychology of the situation during the math wars of the 1990s. And what we found out was that actually the most outspoken parents never had any arbitrary thing done to their children because the administration and the teachers were worried that the outspoken parents would then say, look what they did to my child. And so they actually have kind of kid glove and very fair-minded, ultra fair-minded treatment of those children. Now, I'm not saying that no arbitrary bad thing ever happen to anybody, but I'm just saying, in general, it's not that particularly dangerous to your children to be a careful, wise critic.
Thank you for discussing all these controversial issues with us. Thank you for helping us launch our Comparative Cultures Ethnic Studies curriculum. It is available on our website. And on your way out, pick up this information resource sheet on the back table. At the very bottom of it, we give you the URL for the curriculum itself. It's free to all. Just go take a look. Our thanks to Dr. Williamson Evers, Lauren Janov, Walter Myers, Dr. Barbara Nemko, Dr. Richard Sander, and Toby Philanthropies for supporting tonight's program. If you want to continue to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit the club's website at commonwealthclub.org. And of course, you can also visit our Independent Institute website at independent.org. I'm Graham Walker. Thank you very much for coming, and take care.